I get the pleasure of introducing an amazing team. And I'll tell you this, the only thing that supersedes these doctors' intelligence is their passion to help people. And I'll tell you this, if something were to happen to me, if something were to happen to one of my children, these are the individuals that would be navigating care. And I am wholeheartedly saying that. So, please pay attention, please listen and ask questions. And if you're not able to ask your questions, please come and see us. Again, exit, take a left. We're very noisy, you'll hear us, okay? All right, so this is going to be amazing. So let's rock and roll. First up, Kristen Hughes.
I just have to say it's such a privilege to be able to stand before you guys and to give you guys this presentation. We are going to be speaking about how to create an optimal sensory environment for brain health and for function. So what we want you to think about is, have you ever thought about the sensory environment that you're exposed to? So think about this room. Think about how your sensory is taking in different information. What are the lights like for you in this room? What is the smell? Do you smell anything? Is there any memories that come up with the smell? How does the seats feel underneath you? How do your clothes feel on your body? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Do you taste your mints and the gum in your mouth, or do you taste and smell the coffee that you have in your cups? Now think about that. Think about how does it make your heart rate feel? How is your sensory system within that? Now imagine you went to Tahiti, and how would it feel on your skin, the sand on your skin, the sound of the ocean, the color schemes in your eyes, the smell of the salt water. And so our sensory systems have, So our sensory systems play a huge part in how our brain matures and can heal. And so this presentation is talking about just the different sensory systems that we have and how that impacts our brain. So we're going to get into neuro a little bit.
All right, so I'm going to help set the foundation for why this sensory information is so important for us. And so let's start by discussing a few fundamental concepts about how the nervous system works. And so first of all, the nervous system runs the show. The nervous system is the master system of the body. Every system in the body is under the control of the nervous system. And second of all, the nervous system's primary concern is efficiency. No other system in the body consumes as much energy as the nervous system does, so inherently it has to learn how to be efficient with its resources. So it wants to have a big gas tank and be getting a lot of miles to the gallon. But what happens when our nervous system is injured is that we have that fuel tank shrink down and we lose out on some of our miles to the gallon. But the good news that brings us to our third point is that our nervous system can build itself back up and it can relearn efficiency. And it does this through neuroplasticity. And so neuroplasticity is the ability of our nervous system to grow and reorganize itself in response to stimulus. And it does this process from the day we're born until the day we die, and especially after there's an injury. And so for neuroplasticity to take place, we need fuel. We've got to have that gas tank. We need stimulation of specific neural pathways with the appropriate frequency, intensity, and duration of that stimulus. And we have to do that repetitively. Think about this like a strength training program for your brain. If you're going to the gym and you're hitting the weights hard day after day, your muscles are going to grow and they're going to get better endurance and do their function better. The same concept applies to the nervous system, and in reality, the nervous system does it a little bit better. And so the nervous system builds upon itself through these principles of energy efficiency and through repetition of stimulus. And it has a set map for how it builds itself up. So as an infant's brain is developing, it follows this set structure here. And so the foundation of that is these sensory systems. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about every level here because we are going to focus on just this sensory information, but I'm going to touch points on a little bit about each of these levels just so you can kind of see how they flow into each other and build each other up. And so it all starts with these sensory systems. A baby has to be able to perceive their world in order to learn how to interact with it. And both a developing brain and a healing brain need to be sponges for sensory information, soak that up, process it, and then learn how to create an output in order to grow. And so as we're processing this sensory information, we see primitive reflexes arise. And reflexes are just a motor response to a sensory stimulus. So they're the next level up above the sensory information. But what separates a primitive reflex from a regular reflex, like when the doctor smacks your knee with the hammer and you kick them through the wall, is that primitive reflexes serve a specific purpose to teach our nervous system higher order functions. And so what will happen is we start to get these motor responses to these sensory stimulus and we start to express movement. And so then we see postural reflexes arise. And so postural reflexes are all about protective and efficient movement. Protective and efficient movement needs good core musculature integrity. The purpose of the core is to transmit forces from the lower body to the upper body and vice versa. And so each of these systems feed into our vestibular system, our balance and movement coordinator. And so the vestibular system is highly tied to eye movements, and eye movements are tied to every other functional part of our brain. And so then we see cognitive function build itself up. So you can see as information is passing from one level to the next level, these systems are building each other up simply by doing their jobs in an efficient manner. And so I do want to touch a little bit on primitive reflexes because there's one reflex that's very important to our ability to process sensory information, and that's called the Moreau reflex. And so the Moreau reflex is our startle reflex, like when you sneak up on your friend and they jump real quick. It's our startle response. The purpose of this reflex is to sound our body's alarm system. It's to train our brain how to flip that light switch to set off that stress response, that alarm, but then teach our brain how to also quiet that back down. And so let's talk about what that alarm is. So this is where the terms sympathetic and parasympathetic come into play. And so sympathetic is our fight or flight stress response. Parasympathetic is our rest, digest, growth, and healing. And so these two systems should be on a teeter-totter with each other. And we should be able to flip between the two based on the demands of the task at hand. And that Moreau reflex helps our brain learn how to do that. So in a normal response, what should happen, if a sensory stimulus is that appropriate frequency, intensity, and duration, we might see that light switch go on really quick, have a quick startle, a quick switch into those sympathetic states. But then our nervous system should switch that back off and we should calm back down within about 30 seconds or a minute. But what can happen if that sensory stimulus is too intense for our nervous system to process appropriately is we can be stuck in a perpetual stress response, which our body doesn't want to do that. If we're stuck in that survival mode, we're constantly mobilizing resources and breaking the body down over time. If we're stuck in that sympathetic state for too long, our nervous system and our body don't have the ability to grow properly. And so to summarize everything, there's a set blueprint for how our nervous system builds itself up, both when we're originally developing and then especially when it's trying to heal itself. It'll go back in time and follow these same steps. And the foundation for that is this sensory information. But if a sensory stimulus is too inappropriate, too intense for us, it can feed into being stuck in a perpetual stress response, which isn't good for our body either. And so now I'm going to hand the torch off to Dr. Larson.
All right, so now we're going to talk about what happens when there's not enough sensory stimulation. So we want to talk through 3 different examples of the brain being put into an environment that lacks certain sensory input, and we'll talk about how the brain adapts to those environments. From there, we want to talk through the brainstem, and then we're going to start talking about all of the individual senses. So we'll get into some examples of negative things in the environment that may be creating a negative influence on the brain, and we'll talk about positive alternatives that we like to use to create a better environment for the brain to heal. So around 1990, after the Romanian government was overthrown, it was discovered that there were about 200,000 children being kept in understaffed orphanages. In some of these cases, there was only one adult to take care of every 25 children. So you can imagine the type of environment that these kids were in. Now, we specifically want to talk about the babies in these orphanages. So these babies were separated. They were put into cribs. The only interaction they had was to be fed and cleaned, and this followed a strict schedule. So these babies did not receive the normal social interaction, physical touch that a baby would typically get. So researchers, they wanted to come in and see what had happened to their brains. The first thing they noticed is that these babies had actually stopped crying because they were neglected for so long. When they started looking at their brains, they discovered that all of their brain waves had been altered, and the physical size of the cortex had actually shrank, especially there in the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is a very important part of the brain. This is where our higher order thinking comes from. This is actually what separates us from the rest of the animals on the planet. It's what makes us human. So the prefrontal cortex itself does not process sensory stimulation, but it relies heavily on the systems that do. So if those systems are never properly stimulated, it's going to lead to issues in the prefrontal cortex as well. Now, researchers did follow these babies once they got adopted and they were reintroduced into a more normal life. And what they found is after they started getting the typical sensory input, their brains actually did begin to grow and develop. However, they still had significant deficits in the prefrontal cortex. So some problems associated with dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex can look like poor impulse control, social withdrawal, difficulty regulating emotions, and pathological tics, as well as other symptoms. But lots of these children that came from these orphanages actually experienced a lot of these symptoms, and it seems to have stemmed from a lack of sensory input, especially during a very important time in their development. So the next example we're going to talk about is going to be astronauts returning back to Earth from space. So one thing we tend not to think about is the constant sensory stimulus that Earth is always putting on us, and that's gravity. So our nervous system must be able to process this stimulus and be able to create a force to keep us upright against it. The system primarily responsible for this is called the vestibular system. Now, when these astronauts go into space, they're exposed to long periods of time in zero gravity. So these systems become underactive and they actually begin to downregulate, and we can see them shrink in size. When these astronauts return back to Earth and are re-exposed to an environment that does have gravity, we can actually see these networks begin to grow back and become more functional. And we can see this on advanced imaging. So this is just a really good example of how plastic our brains are and how much they really want to adapt to the environment that we put them in. Okay, so the last example we're going to talk about is looking at a research study that was done in a hospital. So this hospital took 20 preterm babies. They exposed them to 15 minutes of mechanosensory stimulation 3 times a day for 15 minutes over a 10-day period. So what this mechanosensory stimulus looked like is they gave them 5 minutes worth of massage. They gave them 5 minutes of limb mobilization, where they would flex, extend the arms and the legs, move them through a full range of motion, and then they gave them another 5-minute massage. So when they checked these babies at the end of this time period, what they found is all of these babies experienced superior growth and developmental performance, 47% greater weight gain per day without changing caloric consumption. They saw increased waking hours, better movement behaviors, and when they came back and looked at these babies at 8 and 12 months, they found that they were still seeing improvements. So these babies had higher weight and they scored better on their motor assessments compared to their cohorts. So these are the babies that did not receive this additional mechanosensory stimulation. So this is just a really good example of how additional sensory stimulus can create a profound effect on the brain, and not just in the short term. We can keep seeing those changes over time. All right. So now we want to talk about the brainstem. So the brainstem is part of the nervous system. It connects the spinal cord to the brain itself. So all of the sensory information that goes through the entire body must pass through this area before reaching the brain to be processed. The brainstem, if we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it's a much older structure than the brain itself. So all of the function of the brain relies on a good functioning brainstem. I want to show you guys these little yellow nerves that are coming off of the brainstem. These are called cranial nerves. So some of our cranial nerves are responsible for a sensory component, some are responsible for a motor component, and some of them actually do both. But we really just want to focus on the sensory component today. So some of the senses that are involved with these cranial nerves are like our ability to see, our ability to hear, our ability to taste, smell, and feel sensations to the face. And if we can fully understand these sensory pathways, we can begin to activate them consistently over time to strengthen and create a more functional brainstem. If we can create a more functional brainstem, this is going to give us a better foundation for our brain to function on. All right, so now we want to get into each of the senses. So again, we're going to talk about different things in the environment that may be having a negative effect on our nervous system, and then we're going to talk about positive alternatives to help create a better environment for the brain to heal.
So first what we're going to talk about this morning is your visual system. And when we think about your visual system, that's everything that's around us, what we're seeing on a daily basis. And so something important to think about is where that all takes place in your brain. So we have actually neurotransmitter receptors in the retina of your eyes. And so everything that you're seeing on a day-to-day basis has a really big effect on your brain. And so that's why we need to be careful with what we have in our environment versus what we don't have in our environment. So when we think about visual input to the brain, we really have to think about the thalamus. And just a little background on the thalamus. I have a diagram. Oh, sorry, guys. Technology. So there's a diagram here that shows where your thalamus is located, and the thalamus is your brain's information relay station. And so all sensory information that your brain is going to process actually goes directly through the thalamus, and then it is then dispersed via thalamic oscillations, which actually then translate into brain waves, specifically alpha. And we're not going to dive too deep into brainwaves today, right now with us. But your alpha brainwaves are really like a middle of the road, alert, engaged, but not tired and not stressed. So when we think about the brainwave that we really, want to hang out in, it's alpha. 25% of the thalamus is actually dedicated to visual input. And so that's a really large part of the thalamus when you think about everything, all the roles that the thalamus has. So visual input to the brain is something that we want to be really mindful of when we're thinking about the sensory environment that we ourselves are exposed to, as well as the sensory environment that our children or loved ones are in. So, of course, talking about visual input, you probably all know that we're going to talk about screens. We know where you're at. We fully know that sometimes screens are necessary. Sometimes we have to have them. Looking out at all of you, I'm sure you all have jobs that use screens on a day-to-day basis. And so we just have to weigh sometimes the pros and cons. Even with us in our office, there are times when we have to pull out a screen because we really want to get vagus nerve stimulation in, and that's the only way to get it in. So there's definitely a time and place where we might have to have them. But we want to consider the quality of screen time that we are exposing our children to. We want to think about, just thinking about like YouTube, TikTok, Reels. Those are all like 5-10 seconds long. And then we think about attention issues that we see popping up later on with kids throughout school. So it's really important that we think about the quality, the quantity of screens. So that's definitely something we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about just the visual input that our kids and loved ones are getting on a day-to-day basis. Some other things that we want to talk about with just things to eliminate or reduce are LED light bulbs, fluorescent light bulbs, especially after sunset and before sunrise. Because when we think about our circadian rhythm, the circadian rhythm is extremely important in every function of your body, every function of your brain. And the way that we heal is to make sure that we're getting good rest and good sleep. And one thing that really negatively impacts your circadian rhythm is the artificial light that we are unfortunately exposed to more and more and more just as the years go on. So just thinking about the environment that we're in, like let's look at these lights right now. These are really bright lights. We don't have a lot of natural light. So we really want to think about at home, if you are working with your child or your loved one, we want to be exposing them to as much natural light and sunlight as we can, because that's what's really going to improve that circadian rhythm. So let's talk about just that circadian rhythm. So when we have artificial blue light toxicity, that can come from any kind of iPad, iPhone, screen, LED light, but it really does impact sleep. It suppresses the release of your body's natural melatonin. And so it really does negatively impact your sleep. So that's something that we definitely want to be considering just when we think about the environment that we are in on a day-to-day basis. So what can we do about this? One is sunlight. That's probably the absolute most important thing that you can do for yourself, for your loved ones, is make sure that you're getting sunlight. And the best way to get sunlight and really impact your circadian rhythm is going to be watching the sunrise every morning and watching the sunset. That's really going to help with resetting your circadian rhythm and getting it back in a good rhythm to help you get the best sleep that you can. So if we have to use screens, we want to use the dark mode. If you pull down the little corner of your screen, there's an option to put it in dark mode. And I would keep all of your devices in that at all times. So we'll do that. There's also blue light blocking glasses. That's something that would be great if you are someone who has to be on the computer a lot for your job or just life in general. We also want to think about the colors that we have in our spaces. So the color green in particular is actually the same frequency as 528 hertz, which is the frequency of love, healing, DNA repair. So it's a really good one to add into your space. That can be done with pink colors. It can be done with live plants. Live plants are a great addition to any space. And they really do influence all five senses, so we'll go into that a little bit more when we talk about air quality and that area of the five senses. But as far as visual, just having green around live plants, getting outside as much as possible, because if we think about the space that we're in right now, we have a lot of browns, we have white, we have bright lights, versus when you go outside and you're in nature, the visual input to your brain is just night and day difference. We have green, we have grass, we have the blue sky, we have the sun, and those are all so much more positive inputs to your visual system than being indoors. So now we are going to go ahead and move into the auditory aspect.
All right. Hi, everybody. So raise your hand if you play music regularly for yourself or for your loved ones. Yeah? It's kind of like a daily thing for a lot of people, right? And then think about if you had to listen to a fire alarm and you couldn't move, right? Think of that difference between listening to the song that you like. If you've been in my office, it's no surprise that I like to listen to the same songs over and over. That's a thing. Or if you can't get away and you're listening to something beeping, okay? So that plays a huge role in how your brain is processing, right? How your vagal system is responding. And so we're going to talk about the role of sound in the sensory system for brain healing. Okay, so hang with me through a little bit of neurology here. The primary auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe, so in that superior temporal gyrus, okay? So Why does that matter? If you're in our office, you'll hear us talking about that. So whether you've been there or you're going to be coming in, it's nice to have a little bit of that background when we're talking about sound, and we use a lot of different types of stimulation for sound. And an important piece for this is a sense that is contralateral. It's mostly contralateral. So if we want to influence the right temporal lobe, we're going to be playing sound in the left ear, and vice versa, okay? If we want to influence the left temporal lobe, we're going to be playing sound in the right ear. And sound is, in general, cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, and this is why we can, at times, see changes in vestibular function from a certain frequency or from a certain sound, which is pretty cool, right? Doesn't really seem related, but because of the function of that cranial nerve, it is. So noise pollution. This is something that people are somewhat familiar with, but it actually has a huge impact on, let's talk about those of you with kiddos, right, who maybe can't cover their ears or who can't directly tell you that a noise is bothering them. So this is a way that you can help make their environment more healing, more comfortable for them, help keep them in more of that parasympathetic as much as we can. So we're going to think about machines beeping. There's a time and place where maybe you can't necessarily get away from that, but what can we do? How can we reduce that? How can we improve their quality of what their brain is perceiving, even if they're in that environment, okay? Loud roadways is another thing that people don't really always consider if you're used to it. But then you go somewhere quiet and you're like, why are my ears ringing? What, right? Everybody's been there, right? You're like, oh my gosh, my ears are ringing. It's because it was so freaking loud, okay? Ambient TV, a TV on in the background, not ideal, not ideal. So again, like Katie talked about, there's a time and place for screens. There is, we get it, we totally get it. But if it doesn't need to be on, that's just another stimulus that's going in that person is having to process, and it might be too much for them at that time, right? We want to create this ideal healing environment for their brain. And then flight paths, I wanted to throw that in there. Depending on where you live or if you're thinking about buying a house, this is actually really significant. So there's research showing significant impairment in people's sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, their quality of life, and actually the duration of their life when they live directly under a flight path. So just kind of a tidbit to keep in mind in case you're moving. So with increased noise pollution, research shows increases in depression, anxiety, high blood pressure, stroke is on that list. There's a number of other things, but it is very significant. There's a lot of research behind it, and it's absolutely worth paying attention to. It has also been shown that when there's a lot of noise pollution, and this research was done there's research with flight paths and then also research with loud roadways, that it masked opportunities for kids to learn language. A lot of what we're working on with kiddos when they get to that appropriate developmental path is working on their language. So this is something you can think about. Is there a lot of ambient noise going on? Can I reduce something to help improve their language retention or their ability to understand what you're saying? If there's a lot of background noise and you're trying to teach them language, it's just making it more difficult for them. And to, be intentional with sounds. We kind of already touched on this, but reduce as much noise, unnecessary noise as you can. You can consider using headphones. I know I've seen a couple kiddos with headphones, amazing. You know your kid, you know that if you're in an environment like this, they're gonna feel better if you have some headphones on them. Earplugs is another thing that you can use. And if you know, we're gonna get a little bit more into this, but if you know the hemisphericity of which side of the brain you're trying to drive with your kiddo, you can put an earplug in the opposite side. And that's an easy way to just continuously drive input into the temporal lobe that you are specifically trying to target. Okay, so a couple different frequencies that we'll use. 40 hertz is a very frontal, prefrontal, like Dr. Larson talked about. That's going to stimulate gamma brain waves, increases focus and attention, it's creativity, mental clarity, all of these things. This is something, honestly, more for the caregivers. If you need to kind of pep yourself up, right? If you're trying to get that frontal lobe going, trying to be engaged, that's a great thing to do. 128 hertz promotes relaxation. We'll often use this on a child. If they're upset, we'll put this on. A cool thing is on your phone, you can use a tone generator. And so you could be playing music. Let's say they love country music. You can be playing their favorite country music song and have 128 hertz playing in the background. It's going to sound really weird if you forget to turn it off and get in your vehicle, though. That happens to us all the time. All the time. Okay, 528 hertz, the color green, like Katie talked about. The love frequency or the miracle frequency. It's the color green. It helps with healing. It decreases cortisol levels, and it helps with DNA repair. So again, this is a frequency that you can pair with another song that you're listening to. This is also a frequency, if you just search 528 hertz, there's a ton of stuff on YouTube. The Brainwaves app has frequencies that are specifically 528 hertz. If you're not familiar with the Brainwaves app, absolutely look into it. We use it all the time. That has frequencies. It has solfeggio frequencies. It has a whole bunch of different healing frequencies there. And then things that are specific to cellular regeneration, release abundance, trauma healing, all of these different things. So again, Brainwaves app, solfeggio frequencies, and then there's a lot of value to just playing the music that either you like or that your kiddo likes. So we'll ask all the time, we'll ask the parents, what music does your kiddo like? Or we'll ask, we can ask Esther, we can ask you, what music do you like? And then she'll tell us, and we can put that on. And there's a lot of value to that. Okay, so a really cool thing, we do QEGs in our office, and they're just fascinating to get the information from. But there are times when we can't actually get a report from the QEG because there's a lot of artifacts. If you've had one done, you might be familiar with that. However, we can still watch it live, and we're all pretty good at least getting a read of sort of what's going on live. So we've had this happen multiple times in our office where the parents they've been in for an intensive. We were not able to get, there are too many artifacts on the QEG, but they still want it, right? They still want that QEG. And so we'll say, okay, let's go for it. But what we've done at times is have the parent actually sing to the child or talk to the child while we're watching it live. So if you think about, right, the parent is singing into the child's left ear. What are we going to see? Which temporal lobe is going to light up? Opposite side, right side. Okay. So we have watched this repeatedly on QEG. And it is just amazing because this is a child who may not be outwardly responding to their parent's voice. But we get to watch it, and the parent gets to watch it. And I could start crying right now thinking about it, and that never gets old. Absolutely never gets old. So that's a really, really neat thing. And it just shows the power of a mother's voice, a father's voice, a caretaker, their favorite music, their mom singing their favorite song. Because I could get up there and start talking, and we've done this, it doesn't light up the same. I like to think that they like me, okay? I like to think that. But it doesn't light up the same as their mother singing. It's a big difference, and that's really, really cool. Hearing and the vagal system. Everybody's pretty much familiar with the vagal system at this point, especially if you've been in our office. It's cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, 10, 11. It's not just a vagus nerve, it's a whole group. For hearing, the really relevant ones are cranial nerve 5, so that's trigeminal, and cranial nerve 7. So these innervate the tensor tympani and the stapedius, respectively. Why does that matter? Okay, so those are little bones in your ear, and they control the muscle tone in your ear. So, for example, someone with hyperacusis who's just constantly, hearing too much, it's improper tone going on, and that actually has to do with the vagal system. So that's not a cranial nerve 8 problem. And these are the kiddos, they've had their hearing tested, no problem, everything's fine. The parent's like, everything is not fine, okay? Everything's not fine. That's more of a vagal issue. That's cranial nerves 5 and 7. So when we work on the vagal system, and one of our favorite ways to do it in our office is, no surprise, it's the stim pod. Over my career, I've used numerous different tools that help with vagal stimulation, all of these different things, and that is repeatedly the only one that not only we see changes on QEG, but they provide a sustained improvement beyond just the time period that you're using it, which is massive. That's what you want, right? If you're going to take the time to do something for yourself or your kiddo, you want to create some sustained change. So I kind of touched on this, but poor tone changes how the sound is perceived. So that could be that a kiddo, you're like saying their name over and over and over, and they're not responding, right? Is that because they're not hearing you? Or because the tone in those little muscles aren't quite where they're supposed to be? Then just in general, that vagal system activation, improving the tone in your vagal system will not only help with tolerance to sounds, so whether it's the hyperacusis or something else, but it will also help with just their overall ability to perceive their environment, to have proper auditory intake, and to help them when they're in a situation where there is maybe a beeping noise or something else, that they can better tolerate that and it doesn't send them into that sympathetic overdrive. I think that's it for me. Oh no, not it. Okay, let's keep going. All right, so I already touched on this. Symboconscious stimulation. So this is where we're using the stim pod. In our office, we use the stim pod all over. It's one of my favorite things. Absolutely love it. But the symbocontia is in the ear, and it is where the auricular branch of the vagus nerve innervates. So it is an external area where we can get some vagal stimulation. And you can use the Resimax there. You really can rub your finger right there if you don't have any of the other tools. And obviously using the stim pod is preferential. So other things you can do, oh, I missed my pun. I was so into it. Sound solutions, like good solutions. Anyway, come into the office, you'll get lots of bad jokes from me. All right, so you can play music that they like. You can play music from the appropriate side. So if you know the hemisphericity of which side you're working on for your child, a lot of the times we're still what we call more foundational. So we're still working on just brainstem and general brain healing. But if you do know which side, you can favor that side, whether you're in the car and you'll move the sound all over to the left side if you're trying to drive that right temporal lobe, or vice versa. You can place your phone that's playing music on one side. You can put one AirPod in. You can put an earplug in an opposite ear. Those are all options that you can do. And just as much as you can, reduce or eliminate unnecessary noise. So again, whether that's an ambient TV in the background, beeping that doesn't need to be there, whatever that looks like, just kind of take a quick assessment of your environment. Then Brainwaves app, this is what I touched on before. When you're in the Brainwaves app, it has something called binaural beats, and a lot of people are probably familiar with that. But if you're able to put headphones on your kiddo for the binaural beats, it plays frequencies that are just slightly different, and then your brain is perceiving a frequency that's not actually there. And so it's really, really powerful for the brain. Another thing that's really interesting is Marconi Union music. So this has repeatedly in research shown a 65% reduction in anxiety. There's not much else that you can just do at home or play that's going to create that much of a reduction in anxiety. So that's something you can Google. You can have that playing in the background. You can have it playing on the appropriate side, whatever that looks like. But that's a pretty cool thing to be playing as well. Okay.
Alrighty, so now moving on to taste and smell. So why are we talking about taste and smell together? Well, because they're connected. But how are they connected? Okay, so first off, right from the introduction of these senses, we have a connection directly through the anatomy. So a good example to talk about is the feeding example. I see a few people with snacks in here. So think about as we bring food to our mouth. We're going to first smell that food through our orthonasal pathway. But then as that food enters our mouth and we're chewing it, the odors from that food are also going to travel through the retronasal pathway and just increase the strength of that connection. But there's more to the story. So there's actually a particular point of anatomical or neuroanatomical connection right in the frontal cortex. So if we can look up here, from these olfactory receptors, this goes into cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, and goes directly to the cortex. The tongue has a little bit more indirect route. It goes through the brainstem, the lower medulla, through the thalamus, and then back to this portion of the cortex called the caudal orbital cortex. And this is where these two senses come together and strengthen their connections. But more than that, it has connections to other areas that relate to motivation for feeding and reward for feeding behavior. So this is how we can develop a strong, positive connection with the food we eat through these two senses. Okay, now we're going to kind of break down the senses individually and talk about the implications of them on the nervous system. So, smell. First thing to note is there is a direct connection to the cortex. It doesn't have to bypass through the brainstem necessarily. It does have influence in those areas, and it doesn't have to go through the thalamus. So it's a direct connection to the cortex. What does this mean for us? more blood flow instantly to the cortex. One thing we do in the office commonly is the use of essential oils, and I use one all the time, specifically frankincense. So this essential oil has been studied and shown to improve brain oxygenation up to 20% in the cortex. And that is pretty instant. Once you put that on there, that stimulation is going up there, blood flow will go. Also, along with this, improved arousal. Novel smells will increase orienting behaviors, so you will see an influence on that. Another piece to mention here is that the smell sense is pretty heavily connected to the Moreau reflex. All of the senses can elicit one, but due to this strong instant connection to the cortex, it tends to elicit it the quickest. So when we provide new, diverse, novel smells and build plasticity within these networks, we're going to be working to develop the autonomics and learning how to regulate our fear response. A final point to note here is that while there's connections to the cortex, there's also connections to limbic centers, mainly the amygdala and the hippocampus. So this is what will drive memory formation in association with smells, but will also help us develop, again, that emotional regulation or response to a fearful stimulus. Alrighty, now we want to talk about some things that are kind of in our household environments that might be negatively affecting our olfactory systems and our brain in general. So this was a study done in 2023, just kind of looking at a culmination of research on synthetic fragrances and like normal personal home care products. So things like detergents, soaps, air fresheners, those type of things. And they found that there are some chemicals in here that are actually harmful to our brain and really just our bodies in general. So just want to highlight here, the negative impact of these fragrance chemicals can have an effect on our respiratory systems, our nervous systems, and also our cardiovascular systems as well. Here's a nice little table so you guys can check this out. So when you go home, maybe just take a look at some of the products that you have in your house, flip on the ingredient label, see if any of these things match up. But I want to point out right at the top here, in the culmination of all these chemicals, right at the top, we see neurotoxicity and neural issues, including dizziness, seizures, and depression, migraines, things like that. So it can have a pretty negative effect on our nervous system. There's also evidence for respiratory disorders and cardiovascular disease with this as well. So big picture here is we want to just try to limit these as much as feasibly possible. There we go. Alrighty, so this is just a nice little depiction showing all the different materials and chemicals, products that these chemicals might be in. So some things might not be easily available to get rid of, like building materials. We can't necessarily tell you to tear down your house, build a new one instantly. But what we can have a pretty quick effect on are things like the detergents, air fresheners, those type of things, anything that's aerosol can related. And then let's give you some options for what we can do instead. So first thing right off the bat, we can go to more old school cleaning methods such as using vinegar and baking soda. It's not going to smell as nice in your house, however, it will be better for your brain. A good replacement for air fresheners in the house would be just getting the natural aroma of a live plant. And this is going to do other great things for your brain. There's been studies showing that this improves brain oxygenation, focus, shown improvements in anxiety, things like that. And then we can also start leveraging neuroplasticity to have a great effect on these systems with the use of essential oils. So again, we use these commonly. Frankincense is a mainstay, but peppermint has also been shown to have similar effects as far as brain oxygenation and also calming down the amygdala, so calming down that fear response. Alrighty. Now let's get a little bit more into taste. So what cranial nerves does taste involve? So first, cranial nerves 7, 9, and 10. So if you remember from what Dr. Whitman was telling you about the ventral vagal system, this is a big stimulus for that system. From the tongue receptors, taste buds, this information is then going to be sent to the lower medulla, travels up to the thalamus, and then to the cortical centers for processing and other functions. So let's talk about the overall implications of stimulating this sense. So again, the first stop from the receptors is going to be the lower brainstem or lower medulla. There are different motor tracts that go down through here that control our resting muscle tone. So for individuals dealing with spasticity, rigidity, we can start to have a positive effect on those areas. We also can see improved digestion and saliva production. Cranial nerve 7's job is to provide saliva and also tears to the eyes. And then just being a part of that whole ventral vagal system. The vagal system is going to influence all of our autonomics. It's going to influence all of our organs and our feeling of social safety. So we're going to have a huge effect on how our whole body functions together when we stimulate this sense. And then a final piece here is that it boosts the efficacy of primitive reflex integration strategies. So these primitive reflexes are associated with our brainstem, so we can add additional stimulation just to boost what we do. So it's like putting primitive reflex work on steroids. The next stop in the anatomy is through the thalamus. And like we talked about earlier, this just influences brainwave activity. So if we need to calm somebody down or pick up their energy, we can have an effect there. Finally, there's connections to the parietal, temporal, and frontal lobes for the perception of taste, but also, like I was talking about earlier, that motivational and reward behavior related to that. So it's what builds that connection to the food we eat and really develops a positive connection. And again, big thing here, sensation drives function. So we talked about how we're mainly focused on the sensory component, but it's important to note, so the red lines demonstrate sensory, the blue lines demonstrate motor outputs. So if we're going on this theory that providing more sensory information is going to improve the motor output, then as we do that, we're going to, again, have a direct effect on our organs, our respiratory centers, our swallowing, things like that. Alrighty, so what can we do with this sense to really leverage neuroplasticity to get as much improvement in these networks as we can? So it's important to note that there are many different tastes that we sense on our tongue. We taste bitter taste, salty, sweet, umami, and sour. So it's just important to get a variety of taste and really trying to develop good positive associations with things that are good for us. So fruits, vegetables, good healthy fats, those type of things. So really paying attention to the nutrition and diversifying that as much as possible. But we can also use essential oils prior to G-tube feeding for those individuals that have tracheal neuron G-tube. One thing we see commonly is just poor oral health and digestion with a lot of our intensives when they first start. But that's actually some of the first things that start to improve as we do some of this foundational work. So it is really important to try to stimulate those areas when we're doing things like feeding. Even though it's going into the G-tube, we can stimulate the oral pathways. And we really do see like huge improvements in just how their like tongue and mouth look. Like a lot of times you'll see flaky skin, just lack of blood flow. Seriously, within a week, we can see massive changes in that. And that's like a first sign, okay, we're kicking these things on and they're starting to improve. So it's a big deal. Okay, so big takeaways from these two senses is that they stimulate multiple brainstem and cortical areas and are linked together through anatomical and neurological connections and relate to more than just the perception of the senses. They will drive higher order functions. There are some environmental toxins propagated through different synthetic cleaners that we want to reduce as much as possible and find other strategies for. And finally, we can leverage these senses through specific strategies in order to achieve neuroplasticity and achieve better function.
Okay, so now we're going to get into the tactile system. So the tactile system is a sense of touch. It's actually the first sensory system that develops within the womb. The skin is the largest organ in our body, and it's also the largest sensory system that we have. Every touch of the body is perceived by the brain as being safe or as being unsafe. Touch is important for a sense of self, for feelings, for shaping the brain and development. So I want everybody right now to someone that they're next to, give a high five. Okay, so we got a little bit of touch. We got a little bit, right? And it actually made you guys all smile. And so now I want you to go to the person next to you and give them a pinch really hard. Just kidding, don't do it. Especially you two right there. But you can see then how that can actually cause maybe anger or maybe a feeling of like fear a little bit. So touch actually can impact our emotions. It can impact our brain via brain development the more that we get touch. So this is a little picture here to show. So I want you to look at your arms, and you see all your little hairs, or a lot of hair. And then look at just one hair, if you can, just one hair. Within surrounding that one hair, there's all of these sensories that are just for touch. There's some sensory components that are for pain and temperature. Just kidding. For pain and temperature. There's some sensory ones that are just for touch. There's some that actually do like just light touch. So if you just slightly touch yourself, just really lightly, that's a whole other skin receptor. And then if you give yourself like a really big squeeze, that's a different skin receptor. There's vibration. So there's ones that are skin receptors that are just for vibration. There's ones that are just for cold and just for heat. So think about this. If that one little hair is surrounded by all of these senses, these little like receptors, right? How important is that to our brain for our whole body? If you think about it along our whole body, how many receptors there are just to take in what we're feeling. So if I touch something on my right hand, something's touched, that sense goes up through the spinal column, up through the brainstem, crosses over the medulla, and actually it will come on and turn on my left somatosensory cortex and that parietal lobe. So touching along the right side of the body via different types of senses will actually turn on the opposite side somatosensory cortex. So there's also these things called C-tactile receptors, and these are, I find them amazing. They respond actively to slow, gentle, caress-like touch. So like when you're holding a newborn baby, how gentle are we, right? We're just this very like slow, caress-like touch. These are foundational to our social interactions. It creates bonding. It creates the relationship component. When stimulated, information is sent to the insula. It houses self-perception. So the insula is what actually allows us to have our own sense of self, social interactions, and also to have empathy. It releases oxytocin, hormones of the bonding, and it increases social motivation, enhance emotional empathy, reduce physiological pain, and also stress response. So when we are treating in the office, I love to have a caregiver or a parent hold their child. So then we're also releasing oxytocin and while we're treating them. And then we'll also even laser the mama with the same laser setting as the baby with the same laser setting. So you're creating this beautiful environment for connection, for bonding, for brain development, and connectivity, and then releasing oxytocin. So if you just Google search and go look at all these different studies on just touch and where touch impacts the brain, they will show up that it comes up in the insular cortex and the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus and the hippocampus, the amygdala, the cerebellum, the superior temporal sulcus, and many more areas. So just knowing that touch, when you're touching your child, that you are activating all of these different regions in their brain. So within doing that, so the effect of massage on an infant. So when you're giving just massage even, it can actually help improve visual acuity. So if we're working with vision, eyes, tracking, it's really nice to start doing some type of tactile prior as a prep, or even adding some type of tactile information along with it. touch and massage can improve growth, it can improve the immune system, it can improve cognitive function, it can strengthen parent and infant bonding, it can improve responses to stress, and then improve response to pain. So in the NICU units, they don't have anything to actually give the babies for pain relief, and they're constantly being poked and prodded at, right? But within different studies, they have seen that just a parent's hand on the baby can decrease their stress response to that pain. So don't ever underestimate the power of your touch on your kid or on your loved one, the effect that it has for them, for pain, and for their brain regulation. So now we're going to talk about the reflex circuit. So the reflex circuit is when something is touched, sensory stimulation is happening, the brain processes that stimulation, and then there's a motor response. So if you touch something hot, your brain processes it as hot, and then it withdraws your hand from it. So I wanted to give you guys a few things that you can do within that. That's kind of a quick, easy way. So we use this tool up here that's up in the corner. It's called the ResiMax. It's a vibration tool. But you can also just use your hands and do a massage within these different areas of the body. So the reflex for hands, which is the palmar reflex. So if you touch a hand, right, the brain processes that touch, and then the hand closes. So doing massage within the hands. For the feet, the Babinski, the touch is swiping up from the heel up to the pinky toe. The big toes will and the toes will flare out. That's the Babinski reflex. So doing massage, vibration along the feet. For spine, that's the spinal galant. So if you touch the back of your back, you'll have their brain will process that, and then it has a response of hip and shoulder movement. So doing lots of vibration, lots of spine massage. And then for rooting, that's going to be, there's a tactile input along the cheeks and the mouth, and then the baby will turn its mouth or to eat. But so then doing stimulation and massage along the cheeks to help. So the healing power of touch. So different ways that you can also incorporate tactile integration will be giving lots of hugs, lots of kisses, lots of touch, deep pressure, squeezes, then also doing just long, smooth strokes. So it'll look kind of like going up, nice and deep, and coming back down, and just doing nice long strokes. Doing joint mobilization, range of motion, figure eights of the extremities, and then exploration of various textures. So that can look like just exposing them to different textures. Could be feathers, could be different types of washcloths, it could be any kind of textures I can think of, but just on a daily basis, exposing their skin to different textures. And then use of the vibration tool. We use the ResiMax, but you can use any type of vibration. And then massage and vibration on the hands, feet, spine, and cheeks. So to wrap it all up, that they did amazing, be aware of what sensory stimulation is in your environment, and you have the power to adapt and create an environment for healing. So just really quick takeaways for visual, getting natural sunlight as much as possible and diminishing blue light exposure. For smell and taste, using frankincense on the tongue or under the nose, minimize toxic smells. For auditory, playing healing music or music that your family just enjoys. We use the Brainwaves app. You could also use YouTube, solfeggio frequencies, 40 hertz, 128 hertz, 528 hertz, and then also stimulating the vagal system. And then for tactile, doing massage, vibrations on the hands, feet, spine, and cheeks. And thank you.